The history of diversity in the state of Iowa's athletics is remarkable. We all know the influential and inspirational stories of Duke Slater, Jack Trice, or Ted Wheeler, but the story of one other young black man breaking the boundaries of societal norms in the late 1800s is a relatively unknown tale. Meet Frank Kinney Holbrook. Commonly referred to by his nickname, Kinney was moral, respected, a hard-working scholar, and a University of Iowa legend lost to the history books. Holbrook made history as the first black collegiate student-athlete in the state of Iowa in 1895, and the 125 years since then have seen his inspirational story forgotten due to time. The Iowa Hall of Pride, honoring our great state's legacy, has forged out to retell the story of Kinney Holbrook and the impact he had not only on our state, but the Midwest and the nation. Welcome to Tipton, Iowa, founded in 1840. Population 3,207, and the birthplace of Frank Kinney Holbrook. A representative Iowan town of honest and hardworking folk, the town sits in Cedar County, just a few miles east of Iowa City where Holbrook attended school. No one knows their hometown better than Mike Boyle, Cedar County Historical Society treasurer. Mike has dedicated much of his adult life to both learning and teaching others about the historical roots of Tipton.
Tipton became the county seat for Cedar County in 1840. The size of the community hasn't changed, considerably over the years. The migration of black people into Cedar County, a lot of that came, post Civil War. Before the Civil War, we did have known Underground Railroad paths through Cedar County that, to help free any slaves. But it was after the Civil War that they knew firsthand some of the Civil War soldiers that they had come in contact with.
Mike explained how James Kinney Holbrook, Frank's father, found his way to small-town Tipton, Iowa. Born as a slave in Georgia and sold many times, James Holbrook escaped his slavery in Virginia and joined the Union Army as a servant to the Union Army Captain Dillon. Post-war, James Holbrook and Captain Dillon's bond became so strong that the former slave accompanied the Union soldier back to his hometown in Iowa City in 1874, where Holbrook found his new home in Tipton, Iowa as a free man.
His dad was a day laborer and had, because of the work, the varied work that he did, he was well versed in what he could do, and was very respected, within the community.
In Tipton, James Holbrook fell in love with his to-be wife, Pinky Waite, and after 2 years had their first and only child. Frank Kinney Holbrook was born in 1876, and at the time, Tipton was still a blossoming community with a population of 1,250 people 9 years after the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction. James passed away in 1910, a respected member of his community. Frank Kinney Holbrook grew up to be a spitting image of his father, both physically and in his good and moral nature. In 1888, the local newspaper, the Tipton Advertiser, described him as irrepressible, despite his otherwise humble and quiet ways. The son of a blacksmith, Frank learned the value of hard work, which was reflected in his schoolwork and pure athletic talent.
Frank Holbrook and his athletic abilities, and as he was going through school, and he was accepted by his peers. He was just like another student. Outside of, he was superior in his athletic abilities. He was a well-rounded athlete, and his peers, his classmates, and the community just rallied around that and supported him all the way.
As the only black child in his hometown and a standout high school athlete, Frank quickly turned heads his way. I met with author Neil Rosendahl, who has written multiple profile pieces on Holbrook, to discuss the young adult's rise to great heights.
Yeah, Frank Holbrook was immediately identified as a great athlete in high school. He was a state champion, track star. He competed in track and football. And in football, he was one of the top players on Tipton High School football team. He was identified as a potential talent who could compete at the collegiate level. But of course, as a black athlete, doors were usually closed for someone with his background at that time in the 1890s. And he was also an outstanding student. Many of the residents of Tipton kind of rallied around Kinney Holbrook and said, "You need to go to the University of Iowa and show off your talents at the collegiate level."
Upon graduation, Frank became the first black graduate of Tipton High School. Beginning his freshman year in 1895, Frank became officially the first black student athlete in all of Iowa, and one of the first in the entire nation. Playing football and competing in track and field, Frank Kinney Holbrook was a history maker. However, his freshman season was also filled with adversity.
Well, when Kinney Holbrook arrived at the University of Iowa in 1895, he joined the Hawkeye football team. It was a trying year for the Hawkeye football team because it was very disorganized. Again, Hawkeye football had only been around for about 6 years. And to be perfectly honest, the program was going bankrupt. In order to save some money, Iowa decided that season to not hire a head football coach. They just had the actual students themselves captain the team and have the captains manage the team rather than having a head coach. Practices were disorganized, games were disorganized, but I think it also worked to Kinney Holbrook's benefit because there was not a lot of scrutiny about Frank Holbrook being the first black player in Hawkeye football history, about being the first black athlete in the history of the state of Iowa. There wasn't a lot of media attention about that particular story because there was not a lot of media attention toward the team at all. His teammates and everyone put him at the left end position. So ends weren't really pass catchers. They weren't people who touched the ball. They were essentially glorified offensive linemen on the edge where they blocked for ball carriers. But even the stories that did include the Hawkeye football team rarely mentioned Holbrook because he was not one of the featured players.
Playing left end in a time where the forward pass was yet to be invented, the physically dominant and smart Holbrook immediately made himself invaluable to the team. Despite intra-squad bonding, Frank and the team still struggled and finished the season at 2-5 overall. Even worse, a trip to Missouri resulted in a racially heated confrontation.
Off the field, of course, Kinney Holbrook still faced the same prejudices that a lot of black athletes faced, and particularly if the University of Iowa traveled south. That's really when the tensions began to rise with respect to racial tensions. The state of Missouri in particular was a state that had a long history of not being welcoming toward African Americans, period. When the University of Iowa traveled to play Missouri in 1895, there was a dispute that arose at the team hotel where Iowa was meant to stay, where the managers of the hotel did not want Kinney Holbrook staying with the rest of the team. In those instances, white teammates at the University of Iowa, they often rallied around their black teammates, where they said, if a restaurant's not going to serve my black teammate, then we're going to leave. Or if this hotel won't allow this black athlete to stay there, we're going to leave as a team. That was fairly significant at that time. The fact that his white teammates wanted to stick by Frank Holbrook, wanted to stick together as a team, really showed the kind of camaraderie that would be necessary in 1896 when Iowa had a better team and those racial tensions were heightened.
Despite these freshman year challenges, Frank looked forward to returning to the field in his sophomore season in 1896. That summer, Iowa hired famed head coach Alfred E. Bull to lead the Hawkeyes, and Bull immediately took a liking to Frank, making the former left end the team's star running back. It turned out to be a good move, as Frank led the Hawkeyes to glory from there on.
Yeah, 1896 was a completely different year for the University of Iowa. With Holbrook carrying the ball, now Iowa had really one of the best weapons, one of the best athletes in the Midwest at that time, in a difference-making position. Iowa started off with a fantastic win over Drake, in which Frank Holbrook scored 4 touchdowns and really stamped himself as one of the top halfbacks in the Midwest. And Iowa's season just really carried on from there. Iowa then had the controversial game against Missouri, and beating Nebraska is what allowed them to win the conference championship outright and to claim the first conference title in the University of Iowa's athletic history. And it was really all made possible by the great play of Frank Holbrook.
As the first black student athlete in Iowa, Frank Holbrook also became one of the best athletes in the entire nation. With an ability to burst through tackles and use both his size and speed to his advantage, he also set the state record in the shot put for the Hawkeyes in 1896. However, the issue of racism reared its ugly head once again his sophomore year in Missouri.
Iowa opened the 1896 conference slate with a win over Kansas on a touchdown by Frank Holbrook. So Missouri knew that Iowa was actually going to be competitive now, and that Frank Holbrook was a legitimate threat on the field. Missouri sent word up to Coach Bull and the University of Iowa and said that Holbrook, under no uncertain terms, should be allowed to play, that they did not compete against black athletes. Missouri was clearly the best team in that league and had been for a few years. And Coach Bull said, if Holbrook doesn't play, we're not going to play. Missouri really could not afford to cancel the game. They basically had to let Frank Holbrook play. But they did not have to be diplomatic about it. And so from the second that Frank Holbrook arrived, he was under a lot of scrutiny from the townspeople. Townspeople met the train. They were immediately harassing not just Frank Holbrook individually, but really the entire team. And in fact, as they arrived at the field, they saw all the fans in the stands with clubs and with chains and with things meant to psychologically intimidate. And Frank Holbrook said he wanted to play. He said, even in this atmosphere, I want to go out there and play. He did not want to be intimidated. The Missouri players made it very clear that they were not about to have a clean game. He was hit well out of bounds. He was hit late after plays. They would pile on, all those kinds of things. And if Iowa teammates who tried to crowd themselves around Frank Holbrook to try to sort of provide a buffer there for Holbrook, the teammates who were essentially serving as human shields, they then wound up the subject of cheap shots. Eventually, the officials decided, we'll allow the second half to continue, but they did so only by allowing one of the Missouri players that they had ejected to re-enter the game. That proved to be a mistake because that player early in the second half once again punched an official. Not only was he ejected from the game, but the game at that point was called off with Iowa claiming a 12-0 victory. The Iowa players went back on the bus, hopped on the bus, and quickly got out of town. The Missouri fans actually followed Iowa to the bus and pelted the bus with clods of dirt and rocks as Iowa scooted out of town. And in clinching the conference championship, Iowa had secured the first athletic conference championship in school history. The only way that it could have happened was because of the incredible courage that was shown by Frank Holbrook that day.
Although he was supported and respected by his white teammates, the racism Holbrook faced outside of Iowa may have played a factor in his short career. For many reasons, including financial constraints, Frank unfortunately left the University of Iowa at the end of his sophomore year, and returned to his hometown of Tipton in mid-1897. Back in Tipton, Frank continued his father's legacy and took over as the town's blacksmith, but kept his passion and love for the game of football. Frank became the head coach of the Tipton High School football team in 1899 and rapidly improved the squad, leading to many victories as one of the first black head coaches in the entire nation as well. Having returned to a humble and quiet life in the town that accepted him for who he was, Frank found love and married in 1900. However, the short-lived marriage ended 4 years later, and Frank never bore any children. Moving from Tipton in 1904 to Cedar Rapids, but then on to California in 1906, Frank quietly disappeared from his previous life, and from the history books. We know Frank worked as a blacksmith in Santa Anita, California, and also took up boxing. Frank remarried again before suffering a heart attack and died in 1916 at the age of just 39. He is buried in Sierra Madre, California. Despite living his last years in relative anonymity, Holbrook's legacy, particularly in the state of Iowa, runs deep. Though he broke down many barriers, both in terms of race and class, strangely, the history books and records haven't told his powerful story. In fact, in one notable instance, records indicated he was a white man of the same name, which was not revised until years after his death.
And they found Carlton Holbrook was the only Holbrook who had graduated from the University of Iowa in that time frame. So they just assumed that Kinney Holbrook's real name was Carlton. And so for years, Holbrook was celebrated as Carlton Kinney Holbrook. Carlton Holbrook was a non-athlete, a white law student who had graduated from the University of Iowa around that same time frame. But Kinney Holbrook was not on the alumni rolls because he never graduated. And I think that really is just symbolic of how overlooked Frank Holbrook was during his life. And after his career at the University of Iowa, he was a pioneer at the University of Iowa, but it was one of those pioneering achievements that in the 1890s, people really didn't understand the significance.
Frank Kinney Holbrook's legacy proves his fortitude and ability to challenge boundaries, like the sidelines that serve as boundaries to the field. Frank had to push at established lines to achieve greatness.
I think it's great what the University of Iowa is doing now, and people in Tipton are doing now in terms of campaigning for Frank Holbrook to be enshrined into the University of Iowa's Athletic Hall of Fame. And those are all the kinds of initiatives that I think we all should support as Iowans in terms of recognizing our history and remembering the legacy that he left. That's why it's incumbent upon us to honor Frank Holbrook's legacy, even decades and decades after he's died, to remember him and to acknowledge that his contributions to the athletic history, not only at the University of Iowa, but within the state of Iowa, and the courage that he showed is something that should not be overlooked and should not just be dismissed and cast into the back of a dusty history book. He really lived a life of significance in terms of the barriers that he was able to overcome to achieve incredible success.